Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're squaring up that scroll saw blade. No matter what kind of woodworking you do or what kind of crafting you do, it goes in cycles where it will disappear for a while and then it will come up back to popularity. It'll stay there for a while and then it'll disappear for another little while. And it just keeps doing that motion over the years. I have seen many cycles of this over the 28 plus years that I have been seated behind the scroll saw. And it would appear right now, gauging by what I'm seeing on the YouTube channel and the comments that I'm getting, it would appear that we are on that upcycle again. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to make a short video today on squaring up your scroll saw blade. Now, regardless of what equipment you're using in the shop, having it properly set up and properly calibrated is essential to getting proper and good results with that tool. And the scroll saw is no different. Having your blade out of square on the scroll saw can cause you a multitude of problems. And I'll just demonstrate one of them here. What I have is I have a little puzzle piece cut out on a scrap of 3/4 pine. And things that, like puzzles that join together and are meant to be taken apart, or mating pieces, this is where you see some of the failures that are caused by blades that are not square to the table. So let me cut this. I have purposely placed my blade out of square by a couple degrees. Let me cut this one puzzle piece and I'll show you the problem that it creates. Well, while the cut looks nice and it looks like it was cut well, and it is, you can remove it just fine. So what is the problem? Here's the problem. It doesn't remove both ways. It gets jammed partway through because you have now that angled cut, which as you're coming down, it jams it in there and prevents it from going any further. That is the result of your blade being out of square. So for puzzles, it causes a huge problem. But if this were, say, a mating piece of some scroll saw joinery, which is very possible on the scroll saw, don't discount that, they wouldn't match properly. As the edges went together, they would actually be on angles. It would cause a lot of problems and throw your entire piece out of whack. So having a square blade is very important. Well, how do you get it square? Well, quite possibly one of the most common and simplest ways to do it is with a little 2-inch square. Now I have several of these, had them from different manufacturers, different styles, but any one of them are acceptable to be able to square up your scroll saw blade. Even one of these little layout squares would also be acceptable. Any square surface, anything that you can test and get right up beside the blade and test that the relationship between the tabletop surface and the blade is at 90 degrees, you can use it to square up your scroll saw. So what are the steps that you need to follow in order to get your blade square to your table? Well, the very first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that none of this exists. This is the sawdust that we had from cutting that pine puzzle piece. And you need to make sure that if you're going to be using a square or whatever you're using to square up your blade, it has to have an unobstructed connection to both the surface of the table and the blade. So if there is sawdust or chunks of wood stuck to your blade, it's not going to get a proper reading. If there's a piece or a bunch of sawdust or offcuts on your table, you're not going to be able to get that square sitting flush. So first things first, in the area around the blade, get all that sawdust out of there so that you get proper registration of your square against the table. The next thing that you need to do is you need to ensure proper blade tension on your scroll saw blade. If it is too loose, you're not going to get a proper reading or proper registration against the square. So just double check it, tighten up your blade, and make sure that it's got proper tension. When you pluck it, hear that? it should give a nice ring to it. If it's out of tension, it's not going to give you any real tone. You really need to just check it. It should have a nice little tone. There shouldn't be very much deflection from side to side, and that would be a properly tensioned blade. The next thing you need to do is make sure that you have room to get your square in here. So for that, you need to raise this arm up to its highest point. And you could just put your finger underneath it and gently pull up, and it will raise. And now that is as high as it goes, and we now have plenty of room here to fit our square. And at this point, you want to get your square beside your scroll saw blade. And we can see there, hopefully, that it is just slightly out of whack. It can help if you put a light source behind your square, and you will be able to see the gap here between your blade and your square. So at this point, what you really need to do is get in here, loosen off the tension knob on your table or blade setting, and adjust your blade until there is absolutely no light and no gap from top to bottom all the way along that scroll saw blade. My suggestion is not to use a thinner blade like a number 2 or a number 3. I would crank it up to a number 7 at least. That way it is a more rigid connection, and the chances of you deflecting that blade with your square are lessened. So get your blade set the way you need it so that there is no gap. And once you get that, tighten up the mechanism on your saw. And that's all there is to it. We now have a square blade. How can we confirm it? How can we test it? Well, let me show you a couple of ways. Quite possibly one of the easiest ways to test this is to make a cut on some 3/4 inch thick scrap stock, and then using your square, test your cut against the flat surface of your board and see if it is cutting square or not. That is quite possibly the simplest way, but it is not the only way. Another way to check for squareness is to take a scrap piece of 3/4 inch thick stock and make a slight little kerf cut. It doesn't have to be deep, just 1/4 inch will do. Once you get that kerf cut done, spin your piece around to the back side of the blade and try to insert the blade into that kerf made by it. If it fits easily and slides right in, your blade is square. And another less practical method, of course, but it's fun and it gives you good practice, is to, on a scrap piece of stock, at least 3/4 inch thick, draw out another fake puzzle piece and cut it out, and make sure that it slides into its cutout section equally from both sides. If it doesn't slide in and out smoothly without getting hung up, then your blade is out of square, and just like before, you're going to need to readjust it. And there you have it. Squaring up the blade on your scroll saw. Guys, I would love to tell you that this is a more complicated process than what it is. I would love to make it so that I am an absolute genius for doing this. But it's not hard. It is not rocket science. It is not something that you have to be a Harvard graduate to figure out. All you need is a good quality square and a pair of eyes. If you have problems seeing that square against your blade, as I said, you can use a light source from behind, and that will go a long way to helping you see the relationship between the blade of your scroll saw and the blade of your square. If you're still having issues because, like me, you wear glasses and it's hard to see what's going on, there's nothing wrong with a magnifier. Whether it be a handheld magnifying lens or whether it be one that you use to actually scroll with. There's no shame in using something to help you do something properly. So if that's what you need, then that's what you need. Don't sweat it. Just use it and move on. Squaring of the blade on a scroll saw is one of those things that will take your work to the next level. It's not all about control or the speed of the cut or that sort of thing. Because if you don't have your equipment properly set up, no amount of control and no amount of speed or whatever you want to call it is going to provide you with a quality project. Everything will always be out of whack. So it's very important to set it up. So start with the basics, get in there, get that blade square, and start getting some awesome cuts with your scroll saw. Guys, there may be some of you out there that think that this is really just a short, pointless video, but I'm going to tell you that it's not pointless. I guarantee you that there are those of you out there who have just started into the scrolling and really don't know the basics. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of information on the simple stuff like squaring a blade. The manuals will just tell you, square the blade to your table. That's it. That is it. So hopefully today's demonstration will bring you that much further to getting into scrolling and improving your work. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing. You click that bell and then you won't miss the notifications of future episodes of the show. I know that this is a shorter one than normal, guys, but sometimes they're like that. I want to thank you once again for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed today's content. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you're going to get your scroll saw blades squared up. And more importantly, guys, I honestly hope that you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another Alternative Tuesdays.